Hello. Today, we continue with the exciting reading of the Gospel of Mary, Mother of Jesus. In today's video, we will explore passages full of wisdom and inspiration, such as the exaltation of the slave, coming home, and crooked paths.
The exaltation of the servant. I arrived in Ein Kerem after a long but peaceful journey. The miracle of healing little Levi, the son of Manasseh and Leah, not only opened the hearts of that family to me but also surrounded me with an aura of respect and mystery among their servants. They looked at me differently, almost reverently, as if I were someone important rather than just a 15-year-old girl. Although I wasn't used to such attention, I accepted their care, still feeling a bit overwhelmed by the thought of traveling. So far from my small village. As we approached Jerusalem, at a crossroads, Zechariah, Isabel's husband, was waiting for me with two servants. He couldn't speak, having been rendered mute since his wife's pregnancy, something rumored to be a divine punishment for his lack of faith. Even so, he managed to express his surprise that I knew about the child they were expecting, a secret they had carefully kept. During the journey to their home, the servants told me what they knew. Isabel's pregnancy was considered miraculous, though different from my situation. With a mix of gestures and conversation, we continued through the beautiful mountainous landscape until we reached the valley where their home was located. When we arrived, Isabel wasn't home. It was nearing sunset, but I was told she had gone to a small property nearby to tend to some tasks. Anxious to see her, I decided to go meet her. Climbing the slope was difficult, but when I finally saw her, I couldn't contain my excitement. "Isabel, I'm here." She turned immediately, surprised. Though older and in an advanced stage of pregnancy, she seemed as strong and energetic as I remembered. When she saw me, she dropped everything and ran to meet me. There was something in her expression, an awe, as if something extraordinary had just happened. Before I could say anything, she tried to kneel before me, a gesture I stopped with some effort. She exclaimed loudly, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. But why am I so favored, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For as soon as your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. Blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promises to her." I was astonished. It had been less than 2 weeks since I became pregnant, and only my parents knew. It was impossible for this news to have reached Isabel. At that moment, I understood that this could only be God's doing. Moved by a force I could not comprehend, the Holy Spirit, I let the words flow from deep within me. "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has performed mighty deeds with his arm, he has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from their thrones but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things but has sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel, remembering his mercy, as he promised to our ancestors, to Abraham and his descendants forever." We were both overwhelmed. We knew the Lord had used us to proclaim his divine message, one that would be etched in our memories and shared with the world. For me, at just 15 years old, it was all too much. I spent long hours reflecting on these events, trying to make sense of it all. Isabel's greeting, calling me blessed and recognizing my pregnancy, left me stunned. My response to her seemed almost scripted, as if dictated by God himself. And indeed, it was. I understood that it was not my merit, but the work of divine grace. In time, I came to understand that God had chosen me, not because of anything I had done, but to fulfill his plan. I was redeemed by my own Son, even before I could fall, so that he could be born pure, in both body and spirit. All of this was the work of God's love and mercy, and I could only be grateful to serve Him. What I want to clarify most, dear friend, is that I am not a supporter of any kind of violence. When I said that God brings down the mighty from their thrones and exalts the humble, I was not inciting anyone to rebellion, even though I long for a world where resources are more fairly distributed, where no one has too much, and no one has too little. What the Lord inspired me to proclaim was His greatness. The mighty and the proud may sit in palaces, though not all who dwell there are necessarily proud, nor are all those outside of them necessarily humble. Pride is the sin of evil, the worst of all sins. It closes the door to God's work. No sin is as destructive as pride. If I have received a gift from the Most High, and I believe I have, it is the ability to sense the stench of pride and flee from it immediately. That is what I meant when I responded to Isabel's greeting, that only God is truly great, that He alone deserves glory, and that if we are capable of doing wondrous things, like becoming the mother of the Messiah, it is because of Him. The credit belongs to God. As my son once said, we are but unworthy servants, and even when we do things well, we must conclude our day by acknowledging that we have only done our duty, nothing more. However, my stay in Ein Kerem was not filled with heroic gestures or moments of ecstasy and prophecy. No, life unfolded with a comforting normalcy. Isabel loved me deeply, and I helped her as much as I could by being by her side and assisting in the household tasks. She didn't want me to take on too much work since I was her guest, not her servant. More than anything, she needed my companionship. To talk about God and the things of faith. That's how those 3 months passed. During that time, I received the letter from my father, the one I mentioned to you, and learned that everything was going well in Nazareth. Despite my family's pleas, I didn't return with the first caravan led by Manasseh. I enjoyed being in Ein Kerem. Isabel needed me, and above all, I was learning so much about what had become the most important mission of my life, not just becoming a mother but also a teacher. Isabel didn't have children before this. She was already advanced in age when the angel Gabriel, the same blessed messenger who announced the conception of my son, appeared to her husband, Zechariah, to tell him that his wife, despite her age and infertility, would conceive. Zechariah didn't believe the angel and even demanded proof. But with God, there's no room for half-heartedness. You are either with Him or against Him. The Lord is most displeased, after the proud, with the indecisive, those who pray without giving their hearts entirely, who don't truly seek His path, calculating how little they can offer while still avoiding hell. Zechariah, though a priest of the prestigious division of Abijah, didn't believe the angel and asked for a sign. The Lord gave him one immediately. He struck him mute. And Zechariah remained that way until the birth of their son, the fearless and faithful John the Baptist. At that time, though, neither Isabel nor Zechariah, nor even I, knew what the future would hold. The only thing I knew was that in my elderly relative, I had found an endless well of wisdom. As I mentioned, Isabel didn't have prior experience with children. She couldn't advise me on parenting, childhood illnesses, or swaddling clothes. But she was a remarkable woman. She had accumulated much knowledge, as befitted the wife of a respected priest, but that knowledge had not dulled her soul or dimmed her union with the Lord. I decided that if Yahweh had sent me to Ein Kerem, it must have been so I could learn from the wealth of wisdom that existed in that household, learn so I could later apply it. As you know, John, being a mother is far more than giving birth. Raising a child is much harder, much more important than conceiving one. My time with Isabel was one of the sweetest periods of my life. I will never forget Ein Kerem. From her house, we could see the valley, filled with pine trees, similar to the ones here in Ephesus, stretching toward the sea to meet the kiss of the waves. Many evenings, while she was able, when the sun began to show mercy and a cool breeze would rise, we would sit on the terrace of her home and talk. She would speak, and I would listen intently, eagerly absorbing the wisdom she sought to share with me. Isabel was originally from Galilee, like us. Her marriage had elevated her socially, but she had remained a faithful woman of the people, with the added blessing of wisdom. She was not a passive woman, like a mere servant to her husband, as many are in our land. Isabel was a good wife. Sweet and dutiful, but she also understood that she had her own life and that God had a purpose for her as well. This allowed Isabel to understand herself beyond her domestic responsibilities, which she fulfilled not out of resignation, but because it was God's will. Her reflection on Yahweh's relationship with his people ran deep. As the wife of a priest, she knew the intricacies of the law well. Often, during meals and gatherings with her husband's fellow priests, she overheard discussions about the economic significance of the offerings brought by the faithful. It became clear to her that, over time, money had corrupted worship, turning it into a kind of leprosy that eroded the true relationship with God. As a Galilean, Isabel sometimes felt inferior to the educated members of the priestly circles in Jerusalem. Yet she was perceptive enough to see through their facades. Many priests, scribes, and Pharisees prided themselves on strict adherence to the law, but their hearts were often hardened against compassion. They strain out a gnat, she remarked once, but swallow a camel. They strictly observe the Sabbath, she added, but when it comes to helping others, if there's no benefit in it for them, they act as if you don't exist. For them, the commandments are just the bare minimum. They follow what's required, but anything beyond obligation is left undone. It was Isabel who introduced me to the prophet Amos, whose words were as sharp as a sword against the priests. She often recited, I despise your festivals, I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings, I will not accept them. These verses revealed Yahweh's disdain for empty rituals performed without a compassionate heart. Despite her critiques, Isabel upheld the law with reverence. Her guidance helped me appreciate its significance more deeply than my parents ever could. As the wife of a priest, she had mastered the nuances of the law, but she also taught me to give everything its proper value. From her, I learned that the essence of the law is the covenant, and at the heart of that covenant is love, not transactions or conditional exchanges. She often spoke of love, especially when quoting her favorite prophet, Hosea, when Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt, I called my son. Through her words, I understood that God loves us even when we fail him and remain steadfast in his love, despite our repeated betrayals. Isabel's wisdom extended beyond spiritual matters. She didn't know Joseph, nor could she predict the extraordinary man he would prove to be. However, she warned me about the tendencies of men. They often get lost in theories, she said, dreaming up grand ideals while forgetting the practical details. They spend their days fixing the world with their friends, but it's the woman who must manage the day-to-day tasks that keep life running smoothly. And this happens even with the best of men, she would add, often using her husband, Zechariah, as an example. From her, I learned that one can serve the Lord even in the simplest of tasks. Preparing a meal, managing a home, or performing the humblest of chores could be just as pleasing to God as flawlessly reciting a psalm, a prophetic passage, or observing a fast. Isabel often reminded me that what truly matters is love. She would say, there are times when the Lord prefers us to serve a meal to our neighbor over reciting a psalm. But there are also moments when prayer must take precedence. The time I spent with Isabel remains one of the sweetest seasons of my life. Isabel was a wise woman with a deep understanding of life. One day, she told me, men, Mary, are often like children. They need rewards, praise, just like their mothers used to give them. They're always trying to figure out why things happen. But deep down, what they really care about is understanding how things work. They rarely manage to avoid major tragedies, and they struggle with mysteries, always wanting clear explanations, as if their minds were big enough to contain God and everything He created. They love making plans and feel accomplished once they're made, even if those plans soon prove useless. They don't fear war, for example. They have no idea about the daily anguish of women who, as wives and mothers, worry endlessly when their men go off to fight, or what it means to fear becoming the spoils of war for a conquering army. That's why, dear Mary, Isabel concluded, we have a vital mission. We must raise our sons so that, even as men, they carry a part of our feminine spirit. Teacher Jesus, the future Messiah, to always have peace in his gaze. Show him the value of small things, and that what truly matters to God is the love we put into what we do, not just the actions themselves. Teach him also to respect women, to see that we are far more than mere beings to bear children. We are worthy, capable of being as faithful, or even more faithful, than men, who often make grand promises but quickly forget them when things don't go as planned. And finally, Mary, through your nurturing, the wisdom that will teach the world, save Israel, and restore the true message revealed by God to his people will pass. When Isabel gave birth, I stayed with her for a few more days. John was a strong baby, full of life, and it was as if one could already glimpse the prophet he would become, the forerunner of the Messiah. On the day they asked about the child's name, Zechariah spoke again. But his words were unlike anything he had said before. He uttered something that seemed to echo the conversations Isabel and I had shared, revealing that his experience had profoundly transformed him. And you, my child, he declared to little John, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his way, to give his people knowledge of salvation and the forgiveness of their sins. Because of the tender mercy of our God, he continued, looking directly at me, the rising sun will come to us from heaven to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the path of peace. Those words marked my farewell. Isabel, who had welcomed me into her home with kindness and had greeted the child in my womb as Lord, and Zechariah, once so rigid about the law, were now focused on forgiveness, mercy, and peace. Both had come to understand that my son would bring these blessings to the people. Shortly after, I joined a caravan from Manasseh traveling from Jerusalem to Cana. I bid farewell to Isabel, Zechariah, and little John in his mother's arms. I left carrying with me a true treasure of wisdom. I had arrived in Ein Kerem as an unsure young girl and returned as a woman who had begun to grasp the enormity of the mission awaiting me. I was already 4 months pregnant, though it was still easy to conceal it. The peace and mercy of God enveloped me, and those were the 2 messages I resolved to pass on to my son when I held him in my arms. Soon, I would have to journey south again, retracing my steps. But that is a story for another day, dear John. For now, I am tired and emotional. These memories are so sweet, and they bring tears to my eyes. Let me sit with them. I need to be alone with God, to thank him for all the light he brought into my life and that continues to illuminate my soul even now. Returning home. The journey back was a week-long prayer. The servants of Manasseh treated me with the same respect they had shown since my arrival. They knew nothing of my pregnancy, as I had successfully concealed it, although word had spread that my wedding to Joseph was approaching. Unbothered by anyone, I dedicated those long and tedious days to meditation. I used the quiet moments to mentally revisit the experiences and treasures I had been storing in my heart. These were far too profound to let slip away, even though they often exceeded my immediate ability to fully understand them. Now that I could feel the child stirring within me, I began doing what all mothers do, speaking to him. You see, John. By this time I knew he was the Messiah. After listening to Zechariah and Elizabeth, I had become even more aware of the immense spiritual significance of his mission. But I couldn't treat him as anything other than my son. It would have felt absurd to speak to him as if he were a great lord, a tribal chief, or an esteemed priest. He was my child, and I could only speak to him out of love. There was no lack of reverence in this. On the contrary, the respect I felt for him, even though I still didn't fully grasp his divine nature, was overshadowed by love. For love is the fulfillment of all emotions. On one hand, I felt small before the smallness moving within me. On the other, I didn't feel like his superior but rather his mother. It was my duty to care for him, guide him, and most importantly, love him with all my heart, intensely and endlessly. From the moment I became aware of my love for him, it astonished me. I had never loved this way before. Not even my parents or Joseph, whom I cared for deeply, had inspired such feelings. I had heard of the immense love mothers feel for their children, but since Jesus was my only child, I had no basis for comparison. At first, when I realized how profoundly I loved him, I felt afraid. Could God be jealous of this love? After all, he had commanded that he be first in the heart of the faithful. Was I pushing him aside by loving someone as much as I loved the child growing within me? It was then that I began to understand my son was God. I realized this because I felt no jealousy from God. Instead, I felt harmony, no division between God and my son as separate realities. Loving my son was loving God, just as we now know that to love our neighbor is to love him. A week is not long enough to fully process such reflections, but these thoughts consumed me as we finally arrived in Cana. There, my father awaited me at Manasseh's house. To spare me from intrusive questions, he suggested we return to Nazareth immediately, despite my fatigue, explaining that my mother was so eager to see me she couldn't endure even an hour's delay. Joachim brought me up to speed on everything. First, though, he scolded me for not returning sooner, warning that I didn't realize the predicament I was in or the embarrassment I might cause Joseph if someone noticed my pregnancy. I explained to him the situation with Elizabeth, how much she had needed me, and how essential my time in her home had been for me. It had become a true school for a young village girl like me. Speaking calmly yet firmly, I said, "Dear father, we cannot be guided solely by human concerns. Should we follow the paths of prudence and selfishness? If I had been prudent and sought to avoid complications, I would have told the angel, no, find someone else. We have chosen to always remain by God's side. If we stray from his path, even for a moment, we are lost. Our salvation lies in trusting him and letting love guide our steps." My father smiled, his demeanor softening as he recognized my reasoning. He had just realized I was no longer a child. I was returning as a woman, more assured and aware of the responsibilities that lay ahead. Being a good man, he immediately discerned where the truth resided, without insisting on his own opinions simply because they were his. Humbly, he apologized for his earlier agitation, explaining that the family was eager for everything to be resolved quickly. The wedding, he concluded, would take place the following week. It was best to proceed before anyone noticed my pregnancy to avoid gossip and uncomfortable situations. Now, he added, you need to talk to Joseph. Don't worry, God intervened at the right moment. But it's important for you to reassure him. You both must discuss what your life together will look like, as neither your mother nor I know what to expect. The young man loves you deeply, and you can't imagine how much he has suffered. Even so, as I've said, he seems to be much better now. We reached home within hours. It was nearly nightfall, allowing us to cross the village unnoticed. My mother, Anna, was waiting with a fire lit and the humble table of our home prepared. She leaped up at the sound of our footsteps and ran into my arms. Tears streamed down her face as she kissed me and asked, in a voice choked with emotion, about my health and the health of the child within me. I was calm, stroking her hair and assuring her with a smile that everything was fine. Above all, I told her, we must remain peaceful. Either we have faith in God, or we perish. There's no reason to be anxious. If the Lord has begun this work among us, He will know how to complete it. Later, as we sat around the table eating olives, bread, and goat cheese from my father's flock, I recounted everything that had happened in Ein Karim, the signs of God I had witnessed in the house of Zechariah and Elizabeth. The next morning, at first light, Joseph came to our house as arranged with my parents. His eagerness had been difficult to restrain, and it had taken all his strength not to accompany my father to Cana to fetch me. My parents left us alone, and we sat across from each other at the table. But I felt no embarrassment and had no reason to be ashamed, nor was I afraid. He already knew everything and had accepted the situation. In truth, I appreciated his trust in me, as my parents had trusted me. It was an act of generosity for him to choose to divorce me quietly rather than denounce me publicly, even though his decision ultimately required angelic intervention. Given the unbelievable nature of my story and the fact that he knew me far less intimately than my parents did, his actions were more than understandable. There we sat, still betrothed yet soon to be married. I was pregnant by the Holy Spirit, carrying the Messiah, while he was unsure of his role or what his responsibilities would entail. I waited, eyes fixed on the table, not out of embarrassment, but as a sign of modesty, as I had been taught in dealing with men, and to avoid being the first to break the silence. He spoke first, striking straight to the heart of the matter, like the skilled carpenter he was. "Forgive me," he began. "I should never have doubted you. If I have wronged you, even unintentionally, my only excuse is that your father refused to provide any explanation when he told me everything. I was asked to believe the impossible. You deserve someone who would accept the sky turning green before doubting your honor. Instead, I behaved like a jealous fiancé and a man of little faith, unable to see that Yahweh was at work in all this. The worst part," he continued, "was that when I resolved to divorce you quietly, I was mocking myself. Something deep inside screamed at me, telling me I was a fool for rejecting you and the child, for you are the most precious thing in my life. I knew that by letting you go, I was condemning myself to the darkest despair. But men are taught to hide tears, deny weakness, avoid apologies, and withhold forgiveness. That's why the angel had to intervene. Fortunately, he was merciful and spared me the punishment I deserved for even considering abandoning you." With this, he reached across the table and held my hand, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. His gaze was filled with pain and shame but also hope, silently pleading for a gesture of forgiveness. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed his hand gently, and even brought it to my lips, kissing it with tenderness. "Joseph," I said boldly, finding words I had never imagined myself capable of uttering, "I love you deeply. I will marry you of my own free will. If anything, I now realize more than ever how much I love you. But I will not be merely a fixture in your house or a servant. I will be your wife. Some things between us will be different from other marriages. We will have no more children, nor the usual relations between husband and wife. I want you to know this now, while there's still time to reconsider everything. This decision was one I had made long before and didn't know how to explain to you or whether it was fair to ask of you. I have always dreamed of belonging entirely to God. When my parents arranged our betrothal, I wasn't opposed because I had great respect for you and didn't see how I could fulfill my inner call to consecrate myself to the Lord, as our faith has no equivalent to the Vestal Virgins of the Romans. I know what I'm asking is difficult, but we are believers, and above all, we honor God and His commandments. So, Joseph, reflect on this. If we can't ask this of the Lord, who can we turn to? As for your doubts about me, I added, still holding his hand, I truly wish the angel hadn't needed to intervene, as my parents trusted me without requiring any extraordinary signs. But I understand you knew me far less than they did. Your decision to part from me quietly, without demanding public vindication, was incredibly generous. What matters now is that you and I understand we have a great mission ahead. I will be the mother of the Messiah, and you will be the father. To everyone else, you will be seen as the father, and I the mother. In practice, your role will be the greater one, because being a father, like being a mother, isn't just about conceiving and bearing a child. We are not animals but people. We must raise our son together, Joseph, and you cannot leave me to do this alone. Joseph responded. Like the man of God he was. He was calm as I spoke, though I saw it pained him to accept that our relationship would not be like other marriages. Still, he agreed, knowing this was God's will. When I finished, he rose, walked around the table, and asked permission to kiss my forehead. I consented, and he embraced me, whispering, "My beloved, you have told me what my soul needed to hear." Without it, I would have lived tormented, even if I had endured everything out of love for God and for you. You've said you love me. That you will be my wife, and that you care for me. Everything else is secondary. I now understand love isn't just physical contact. I will honor your virginity and offer mine as well so that it may serve the Lord. Our home will be a place of love, and in that love, we will raise our son, who, as you said, is also mine. For him and for you, I will fight like a lion. I promise no father in Galilee will be more devoted than I in defending his family. Knowing this is God's will, and knowing you love me, is the greatest gift I could ever receive from the Almighty and from life itself. And so it was, John. There was nothing more. From that day forward, our love was expressed through gestures of tenderness, as we were husband and wife. But nothing beyond that. I understand that Greeks and Romans, with their more relaxed morals, might find this difficult to comprehend. But to think that two people cannot live together, love each other deeply, and remain virgins is to reduce humanity to the level of animals that eat when hungry and mate when it pleases them. Joseph and I entrusted ourselves entirely to God. Knowing the road ahead would be arduous, and His grace never failed us, when our son was born, the house was filled with His presence. Truly, as Elizabeth had told me, we felt the Lord walking among the cooking pots and the carpenter's tools. Living alongside Him, watching Him grow, we were enveloped in His presence. How could we desire anything else but to live for God and for Him alone? After that conversation, we called my parents. They entered the room, smiling when they saw we were united in our decisions. Since Joseph was an orphan and independent in his choices, there was little else to explain. The preparations for our wedding were finalized, and the ceremony was set for the following week. Everything went smoothly, following the strict ritual established by Jewish law. The migdanot, which the groom gives to the bride's family, was handed to my father with great ceremony, and he immediately transferred it to me so that I could add it to the dowry. It was 50 shekels of silver and a few dresses, normal for a man of modest means like Joseph. On my side, I received the same amount in money and much more in household items, things that Anna and I had woven over the years, preparing for my future home, which was now transformed into provisions for welcoming the Messiah. The amount wasn't large, but to us, to Joseph and me, it felt like a treasure, especially when we found ourselves in our home, His house, which from then on would also be mine. The celebrations, as was customary among our people, lasted a week. To pay for them, we spent a good part of the money we had, though my parents and other relatives helped a great deal. I felt a twinge of regret about this spending because it meant I was depriving the child who was about to be born of something I wanted to give the world's very best to. No doubt, if we hadn't done this, it would have drawn attention and given people something to talk about, and that, dear John, would have been far worse. From that moment on, I began to educate my son and would tell him, feeling his tiny movements within me, that to love, sometimes we must give up things even though, at other times, the best becomes the enemy of the good. The wedding went like the others in our village. Accompanied by my family and friends, I walked to Joseph's house. They didn't paint me as much as the others, but I couldn't avoid the crimson touch on my face, for the same reason I've already shared with you. What I loved most, though, was the flower diadem they placed in my hair. As we walked through the streets, from my parents' house to Joseph's, the noise was overwhelming. But when we arrived, and he lifted the veil, took my hand, and, before the rabbi said the ritual words, "Mary, you are my wife, and I am your husband," from today onward, the silence was complete. I couldn't help but feel two emotions. On one hand, I was marrying the man I truly wanted, but on the other, I was renewing my first yes to God, the one I had given to the angel Gabriel months before. I was the wife of God, the future mother of the Messiah. I was also Joseph's wife. I was determined to stay faithful to both commitments, and a shiver ran through my body because I knew how difficult this would be. The truth is, it lasted only an instant. Although the joyful shouts of women, typical of our people, filled the air again, I whispered to the Lord that I was not afraid at all. I was in his hands, and I had no reason to doubt that he would guide me through this labyrinth that he himself had led me into. If anyone was trustworthy, it was God. So, any doubt was an unforgivable offense against his love and providence. However, Joseph had noticed something. With a swift gesture, he wiped away a tear running down his face, gently cupped my chin, and whispered in my ear, "Do not fear. Everything will be fine. God is with us, and I will live for nothing else but to protect you." I feel like the luckiest man in the world to be able to do this. I will keep my promise to honor you because I am in love with you, and being by your side, helping you, and loving you is more than enough for me.
The winding paths.
Among our people, dear John, you know the saying, God writes straight with crooked lines. This is known here in Ephesus as well, perhaps due to the common experiences of those living around the sea that the Romans consider their own. It was not long after we got married that my pregnancy became noticeable. Quickly, the gossips began. There was no danger, as we were married, and in the eyes of others, the pregnancy was merely a sign that Joseph had taken possession of his future wife. This was not uncommon in Nazareth, nor would it be the last time. The difference was that no one expected such a thing from us, Joseph and me. For my parents, who knew our secret, it was not too painful to hear the spicier things being said. Not that we liked it, but we were prepared for these barbs, having given our yes to God, fully aware of this possibility. It's an advantage, dear John, to anticipate problems and face them. This way, you can prepare to bear them without being overwhelmed. I worry about couples who marry believing everything will be easy. Difficulties are inevitable, and the best one can do is not to worry about their occurrence. What do you expect? One might ask the young woman who discovers her husband's flaws after marriage. Did you think you had married an angel? Likewise, the same question could be asked of him. Therefore, for Joseph, Anna, Joachim, and me, the malicious comments were less harmful than expected because we were already prepared for them. Each time a neighbor said something to my mother when she went shopping, she did not become indignant or angry to defend my unjustly stained honor. On the contrary, she offered herself to the Lord and prayed a prayer that we all repeated, "For you." In this "for you," we found the strength to endure everything. It was more difficult for my parents than for me because, being the target of criticism while friends congratulated Joseph, they suffered more to spare me from difficulties. As you know, in love, the one who loves takes on the troubles of the beloved. But they, like me, were comforted by that "for you," which we repeated whenever something hurt us. Yes, John, we grew a lot spiritually in those days, thanks to all this. These were lessons I later taught my son. I also taught him to remain silent. When insulted, as the prophet said, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Notice, John, that from the womb, my son was the patient servant announced by Isaiah. Conceived miraculously, in the purest and cleanest way a human can imagine, he had to listen, through his mother's ears, to slander that denigrated not only my honor but also his. Therefore, my silence offered to God was, from the beginning, the best school for what he later had to fulfill on the cross. However, those were not the only winding paths through which the Lord wrote his plans. We had been married for a short time. I had just entered the 8th month of pregnancy, and my mother and I were preparing to welcome the child. The village gossip had ended, as it always does, and our humble silence avoided making enemies. Everything was going well when a Roman patrol arrived and gathered the men in the square near the synagogue. The proclamation was read in Latin, and then a scribe accompanying the soldiers translated it for us to understand its contents. It was a surprise for everyone, but especially for Joseph and me. It was a decree from Emperor Augustus, valid throughout the empire and therefore for Israel. It ordered every man to return with his family to his place of birth, to the ancestral home of his family. This was politically terrible as it reminded us once again of our subjugation to the Romans. In fact, there were rebellions and revolts among the zealot guerrilla groups who spoke of resurrecting the old Maccabean rebellion against the ambitions of Antiochus, the Syrian. It was actually an economic measure intended to control everyone. To be able to tax them and ensure no one escaped the authorities by not being on the census. Everyone understood this, and it caused more resentment because it affected their pockets more than their honor. For Joseph and me, the problem was very different. Joseph was of David's lineage and had to go to Bethlehem, south of Jerusalem. From Nazareth, especially in my condition, it was a week-long journey, similar to the one I made when I visited Zechariah and Elizabeth. We faced many risks, the risk of miscarriage due to my advanced pregnancy and the tiring journey, and the risk of attacks and looting, not only from bandits but also from zealots who threatened to kill those who followed Augustus's orders, calling them idolaters and collaborators. We didn't know what to expect in Bethlehem, as many in Israel were descendants of David and accommodations might be scarce. We had no choice but to obey. We felt like a reed swayed by the wind, holding each other's hands with concern in our eyes. The child moved within me, and his constant kicking made me more nervous, reminding me of his imminent birth and our fragile states. I was constantly tired. It was my first childbirth, and I had no experience dealing with the fatigue that overwhelmed me, leaving me almost useless in the early afternoons. "What shall we do, Mary?" my husband asked. "If we don't go, we'll have many problems with the Romans. If we travel, we'll risk zealot attacks and put you and our child in danger from the harsh journey." "Joseph," I replied, smiling to reassure him, "we'll have to get used to surprises. I've been surprised so many times in these 8 months, I'm sure this won't be the last. Don't forget what we've said, only by believing in God and that He is behind all of this, even the most incomprehensible parts, will we be safe. If we doubt, if we get nervous trying to enforce our plans, it's more likely we'll make mistakes." Don't you think that if God has been so concerned with this work, the birth of the Messiah, he won't let everything get complicated because of an order from the Roman emperor? Isn't he greater and more powerful than all the rulers of the earth? Again, Joseph, I repeat the prophet's words we should never forget, and trust is your strength. So, let's prepare to leave as soon as possible. We didn't take many days to prepare. As we weren't the only ones traveling, many caravans were organized throughout the country, making the roads quite crowded. It was an additional problem, but it also provided protection against bandits. My husband carefully prepared a donkey we had at home, making a kind of basket where I could be shielded from the sun and relatively comfortable. He walked beside me, leading the animal. Fortunately, the donkey was so gentle that it didn't startle us at all during the journey. This time, we didn't stop in Ein Kerem to avoid deviating from the route and to reach Bethlehem sooner. We didn't pass through Jerusalem either, skirting around it to avoid the large crowds in the city, which tired me even from a distance. We stopped early in the journey in Cana, at the house of Manasseh and Leah. They had attended our wedding and given us a wonderful gift that greatly helped us financially in the first steps of our new life. They welcomed us warmly, facilitating our journey to Jerusalem, as Manasseh had organized several caravans to lead pilgrims throughout Israel who, like Joseph, had to follow the emperor's orders. Leah showed me little Levi, who had grown quite a bit, and had him kiss me while asking me to continue praying for him, as she wanted him to be healthy both in body and spirit. As we left their house, they gave us several coins that Joseph refused to accept, but I had to take them to avoid offending them. I didn't feel bad about accepting them because, dear John, there's nothing wrong with being poor and accepting offerings when one is hardworking and does everything possible to move forward. The problem is getting used to living with that help. It seemed to me that these and other gifts from Manasseh and Leah were contributions from all the good men of Israel to the cause of the Messiah, even though they had no idea what was growing in my womb. If they gave generous offerings to the temple, why wouldn't I accept the donations that would allow the Messiah to fulfill his mission? We mustn't forget that helping God's work is a blessing because alms are not a favor given to him from whom everything comes, but an opportunity to contribute something he has given us for the best cause, his own. But that was harder for Joseph to understand, and I accepted everything and saved it. Soon, however, it would be very useful. We arrived in Bethlehem in the middle of the morning. It was the final stage of our journey. We had to settle there and prepare to return to Nazareth as soon as possible, which, however, would take a few months, as childbirth was imminent, and I didn't want to travel with a newborn. We learned from other pilgrims that the city of David was overcrowded. The city was small and couldn't accommodate all those claiming descent from the great king of Israel. Many decided to stay in Jerusalem or other villages until they could register in the Roman census. But, as we were close to childbirth, we couldn't afford to go back and forth, and Joseph didn't want to leave me alone at all. So we had no choice but to seek lodging in an inn or a house willing to take us in. John, you should have seen what we went through in Bethlehem. Joseph had no acquaintances there, and the letters of recommendation Manasseh gave us were useless. The village's 2 inns were full, and I was honestly glad we didn't find a place there due to the disarray and terrible atmosphere. Joseph was nervous, leading the donkey by the reins, taking me from house to house, pleading for a place. He even showed me to the women to elicit their sympathy, explaining I was about to give birth. All the houses were full, mainly with family members, though some had taken in strangers like us who arrived earlier. We weren't treated badly. Many women sympathized with me and promised help when the time came, but they showed me their crowded homes, unable to take in anyone else. Finally, a lady, seeing our distress, told us about some caves at the edge of the village, at the beginning of the Great Valley. There, she said, only cattle are sheltered, but you might find a place to stay, at least for one night. Indeed, time had passed, and after going from house to house, the day was ending, and night shadows were already falling. We decided to try and, asking here and there, we reached the caves, not far from the village. There was no one there. The sheep, the main livestock of the village, were further down in the valley where the winter pastures were. The caves were more like long tunnels than wide spaces, and we decided to settle in the one closest to the entrance, partly because the smell wasn't as strong. John, if you had seen that place, your heart would have sunk. It was a cave like many others, but it also sheltered livestock and was full of manure. The smell was unbearable, and the darkness of its recesses was frightening. Joseph entered with a lit torch and assured me it was empty. Exhausted, I cleaned a corner as best I could, and we spread our blankets there to spend the night. The donkey stayed with us to provide warmth and protect us with its body. I had to reassure Joseph again, though I confess I needed reassurance myself that night. As you know, we women often have to be strong, even when we're trembling inside. My poor Joseph was disheartened by our miserable situation. This is not the right place for the Messiah to be born, he said emphatically. Tomorrow we'll leave. No matter the cost, I'll find a worthy place for you and him. What kind of man am I, Joseph concluded, if I can't find a decent place for the birth of my son sent by God to save his people? Dear, I replied, don't be nervous. Remember what happened to your ancestor, King David, who we're here for tonight. He also wanted to build a great temple for the Lord, but Yahweh didn't accept it. Maybe he wanted to teach him a lesson. Perhaps he wants to teach us and others something with this humiliation we're now facing. In truth, Joseph, there's no palace in Jerusalem grand enough for the Messiah. Anything is too little for him. So, isn't it a sign from the Most High that the Messiah comes for the humility of the heart, not for luxury and honors? If he were born in a palace, how could those living in caves feel connected to him? How could those who have nothing hope to give him something if he already had everything from birth? And without giving, how can one experience love? In the end, and this comes from a woman about to be a mother, you only love what costs you a lot, what you somehow built, what depends on you. When God presents himself as the Most High, we can worship or fear him. But when he shows humility, we can also help him, and it becomes easier to love him. Don't you understand, dear Joseph, that the Messiah is about to be born and the Lord is giving lessons to you and me, so we can later pass them on to him and all people? This will be one of the first lessons we'll teach him. Son, we wanted to offer you a palace and could only give you a cave. Many will do the same, wishing their spirits to be luxurious homes for you, but only offering a shelter where sin's impurity abounds. Do not reject them, do not flee from the poor in body or soul. Look at their good intentions, and if they can give you only a cave, do not refuse to live there, for you were born in a cave, a refuge for animals, not surrounded by marble and silk. So we slept that night. We were a bit cold, despite the warmth of our donkey, but we offered that too to the Lord. The for you was more effective than the best reward to face something that would have made anyone else retreat without the greatest goal of love. In the morning, Joseph went out looking for another place. He said he wouldn't be at peace unless he tried to find something better. I was sure it wasn't by chance and that, for some reason I didn't understand but was beginning to perceive, everything was in the Almighty's plans. So I decided to make our piece of the cave relatively clean and comfortable. When Joseph returned, discouraged and with all the world's negatives on him, he found a much more welcoming place than he had left. He brought food and some clothes he bought at high prices since merchants were getting rich by exploiting foreigners like us. We were eating our bread with olive oil and cheese when a farmer arrived. He brought a cow and was surprised to find us there. Irritated, he asked who had given permission, as that cave was his and he sheltered his cattle there, including the cow he had just milked and couldn't leave the previous night because he didn't have time. Now the animal had to take its place, and we had to leave the cave immediately. I thought, must we accept this too, Lord? That a cow is preferred over your envoy? That the Savior of Israel should be born in the field, cold and afraid, so an animal can be sheltered? We have no home, and even the animals are preferred over us. Lord, may your will be done in this, as in everything else. We are in your hands, my son included, and I will not doubt your loving providence. So I held Joseph's hand, who was arguing with the farmer about my health condition, and asked him to be quiet and leave the cave. We left. I couldn't avoid a tear, but it was just one. Inwardly, I forgave the man so there wouldn't be a trace of anger in me, as I felt any bad feeling would harm my son more than the intense cold in the middle of winter. We immediately went to our donkey, as we didn't want to put it inside the cave during the day. The cow was also there. It looked at us with the bewildered eyes these animals have and continued eating the sparse grass on the ground. I was already getting on the donkey, and we were ready to leave when the man appeared with one of our blankets in his hand. He was in a bad mood, more with himself than with us. He handed us the blanket without a word and pushed the cow into the cave. But the animal didn't move. The farmer, surprised, began to scold. "What's wrong with you?" he said. "You're the gentlest animal in the village. Come on, move, or I'll make you move with blows." Joseph and I looked on in surprise and some pity for the animal. The cow, unmoved, spread its legs a bit more and resisted the man's attempts. He grabbed a stake and began hitting it fiercely, venting all the anger he felt against himself for his bad action on the animal. The cow remained still. With its head down, it endured the blows. Occasionally, it looked at us and continued bearing the tremendous beating. The only noise was our donkey, which suddenly became agitated, making me bend down not to fall off its back. This went on until the man grew tired. He looked at Joseph and me, who were still distressed by his outburst of rage and didn't dare intervene to avoid his anger turning on us. Finally, sweating heavily, he stopped hitting the animal, which was bleeding in several places, and turned to us. "Here, have the cave," he said, "and the cow too. God knows why it doesn't want to go in. Maybe it has more heart than I, who almost forced a woman to give birth on the street." "Stay in peace," he said with a voice broken by exhaustion, "and you can give me anything for the cave and the animal. Take advantage." And he left. I wanted to thank him, but Joseph stopped me. The atmosphere wasn't right for anything but silence. Later, we became friends and understood the bitterness of his spirit. Joseph gently helped me off the donkey and into the cave, making sure I didn't fall. Smiling, he said, "Remember Balaam's donkey." In this case, the cow didn't speak, but was very explicit in defending the Messiah's rights. "We'll have to take care of her." So we settled in that blessed cave, which brings me so many good memories. We arrived in Bethlehem because of a distant emperor's decree who knew nothing about us and cared even less, but it allowed the scriptures to be fulfilled and my son, a descendant of David, to echo the prophet Micah, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel." God knew, John, how much our people value the ancient prophecies and didn't want to leave any loose ends. Yahweh looks down from heaven and sees everything, past, present, and future. We only see a few steps ahead and think we know it all. That's why, when we don't understand something, we get nervous and even doubt that God exists or loves us. Listen to an old woman, John, "Be calm, always trust, and you will see God's radiant face shining in the sky, dispelling the darkest omens." As For how Jesus was born, I'll tell you another day. Now I'm going to rest a bit and reminisce, for these old stories are sweeter than honey and more precious than the finest treasures.
Dear ones, today we share 3 more chapters from the Gospel of Mary, Mother of Jesus Christ. I hope you enjoyed it. Soon, we will continue with the narration of this beautiful and edifying story. May the Most Holy Mary always be by everyone's side. Amen.